Good morning, 8:15 on this Wednesday. It is hump day.
Woo.
Thank goodness.
No.
Middle of the week. I love this. Okay, thank you for joining us. If you have questions, comments, concerns about the topics we're going to be talking about, just leave them in the box below. We do appreciate everything you have to say. We have a lot of viewers chiming in about the beer name. We're going to get to that in a second. But
so start thinking about it now.
Yeah,
we're long story short. We're partnering with a local brewery to make a beer. It's a citrusy IPA. Keep the comments coming while we're talking about other topics. It's a little bit of an orange zest IPA.
So we're asking for names, whether it be to do with Morning Blend's name or Extra Shot. Let's blend it all together and create a brew. And what was that, Producer Billy? Beery McBeerface.
No.
What? Was that his suggestion?
Was that your suggestion,
will not
be the name.
Look at me just saying the things that Billy says. Beery McBeerface. Yeah, no.
We'll get to that a little later.
Yeah, a lot of comments right now. Your Facebook page or my Facebook page?
Well, and right here in these comments.
And these comments. Gosh, we're on Facebook Live.
She's going on vacation, so she feels like she's on her Friday.
I'm going to the Jersey Shore.
Great.
Have any of you been to the Jersey Shore? That is the question. I haven't. I'm interested to see what this is going to be like. Anyways, we digress. Let's get to the first topic. Very important because it has to do with an important time, a devastating time in American history, and it has to do with the Detroit riots that happened back in the 60s. We're going to get into the history of it, but know that a film directed by Kathryn Bigelow is coming out this Friday. It is called Detroit, the movie, and there's some controversy around it. I wouldn't even say controversy, excuse me. There's been some conversation around it because in one breath, people want to say, director Kathryn Bigelow, yes, Oscar winning, yes, amazing director, but should she and can she accurately tell this story or help direct this story if she's a white middle-class woman who is from the greater Northern California region, didn't go through the struggle at all? And she's commented on it saying, no, I agree with this sort of thing. It's a challenge that I was willing to accept. But that question has been posed. We do have more from Marcus Allen, but Cornelia, I want you to go into the history of the Detroit riots back in the 60s.
Right, so in the 60s, and I'm not old enough to have lived through this, but my grandparents were in Michigan, migrated from Arkansas during that time. So this was an experience that many cities in America went through during the whole civil rights movement. And I say that because same things happened in Oakland, Los Angeles, Chicago, Milwaukee, Washington, D.C. If there was a major city at the time, the same temperature was set across the country. So Detroit riots happened. There was a time, again, civil rights movement when...
And this was at 67, I think.
67, when there was this dynamic between people of color and non-people of color, and it was just a very tense time. So it kicked off where at the height of just people being fed up and just in the height of the pot over boiling, police raided a bar. And the patrons in the bar were black soldiers who came back from the war. They felt like it was just another example of abuse of power. That kicked off the riots, and it lasted 3 days. But the Detroit movie is specifically focusing on the Algiers motel incident where police said that they heard that there was a gunman in the vicinity of the hotel. They then raided the hotel. 3 black men were killed. There were 2 white women and I believe 7 additional black men who were beaten, badly beaten and tortured in that hotel, in that situation, on that night, particular incident. But while that was happening throughout the city, there were riots on top of that. So the movie, I haven't seen the movie, but apparently it addresses all of that. It shows what happened.
How the police officers got off on this.
How the police officers got off on this, and this was... if I'm not mistaken, it was the Detroit Police Department, the Michigan State Police, and the Michigan Army National Guard were involved. So it was a citywide event, but the movie specifically talks about that incident within the entire scenario. And again, at the same time, you had stuff going on around the country. There were riots at one point in every major city across America. So it talks about, that's what it really talks about.
And then we were talking about on Morning Blend this morning, if you caught the show, thank you, 5 to 7 in the morning, we were talking about how from where I'm from, which is Southern California, in school, when you start learning about your American history, this specific night, this incident, unlike Michigan and the school districts there, it was not ever talked about. I didn't know about this incident until hearing about this movie, which is a beautiful thing in the sense of, okay, now we know, and now we can look at a situation like this and see 50 years later how far we come, but then also question, have we come that far? Why did we not know about this story before? Who was in charge of the history books in terms of what is written in them? Because what's written in them is then, it flows down to us, what we learn, and then how we understand the world, or maybe don't understand the world, and we go off to college and in our adult lives, and we're maybe oblivious to these sort of things, so that when the relationship between people in the community and our police force, it is still so strenuous. There is that tension. While we love our officers for protecting and serving and all of that, I mean, I have a father who's in the Army, along that same thread of people who sacrifice their life to protect everyone else. There is still a lot of incidents where you're seeing that police brutality, and that's what that movie is about. But Dina, I'd like to know, you're from a different region on the West Coast. Did you learn about the Detroit riots growing up?
And you know, I mostly went to school in California and Nevada growing up, but no, I didn't hear about the Detroit riots. I didn't know a lot about it. And to be honest, if I remember, you know, learning American history in high school, it was more about how the government works. It was more about how a bill gets passed.
3 branches.
I mean, yeah, there wasn't a lot about the culture and the time in this country. Unless it was a specific course I was taking in college, it wasn't something we really learned at the high school level. And so then that brings, you know, up the point in the question, should we be learning about these things at an age before we get to college? Because in college is where a lot of people are exposed to diversity for maybe the first time in their lives. And I know, you know, there were a lot of African American and Asian and Latina and Latino communities at my school, and it was University of Oregon, so it wasn't the most diverse, but we certainly still had a mix of everything. And you can grow up in an all-white community if that's where you were raised. You can grow up in you know, it's not segregated necessarily, but you aren't always exposed to those things until you get to college, and then it's almost like now I'm ignorant and naive for not knowing things, is how I kind of felt when I learned about things later in life. Like, why didn't I already know about this stuff? And you kind of like maybe want to
act like you do remember because you've heard something about it.
And you feel like you should know. So then is it something that should be taught at the high school level? Because for people in your community in Michigan, that's something that was hitting very close to home, but that was a sentiment felt around the country at that time.
And then it was a tone. So again, there were riots pretty much at one point in a lot of major cities. So it's the idea of when you have history and you have history books, it's hard for someone to write history from the perspective that will make a certain group look like they're in a bad light. So you can't, sometimes people just can't say and write on paper, the riots happened and racists and police officers killed black people. It's hard to write that down because some people take personal ownership even though they had nothing to do with it. They can't do it. It's just
talk badly about their people,
right? And because nobody wants to do that, and it's uncomfortable, and it just starts another conversation that you're going to be forced to have. So, but then again, in regards to history, that is the case, not necessarily with riots, but across the board. Because how much do people really know about slavery? How much do people really know about the Native American struggle, the Trail of Tears? You hear surface level information, but you don't really get the facts and the details unless you're talking to someone specifically a part of that culture. So I heard a quote a long time ago, and it said, "The lion can't tell the zebra's story." You
so
can't.
Can Catherine tell this story?
You will only be able to see it once. You only will be able to tell once you see the movie, because there's a way to do research and there's a way to address things. So sometimes people do research based on, you know, just take surface level. Hey, I read this book and it said this is what went down. But sometimes with stories like this, you got to talk to actual people who were involved. You got to talk to the grandparents. You got to talk to the community, people who were right there looking, because in most cases, the actual events will not sound the same based on someone else's perspective.
Right. And just the wrong choice of words could make it seem more glamorized than it was.
And you could be on two sides. The same thing kind of, you hear the same stories when you hear about Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon B. Johnson. Some people think Lyndon B. Johnson was a great man. Some people think Lyndon B. Johnson was not. It depends on what side of the conversation you're on.
And can I open this up? I know we'll get to some sound in a minute, but on a more current pop culture level, the show The Bachelorette is going on right now, and one of the contestants that was on this season with Rachel Lindsay was Lee Garrett. And in the Men Tell All on Monday night, it was pointed out that Lee had made some what many consider to be racist comments in a tweet last year. So the tweet that he put out in the universe on July 13th of 2015, excuse me, so 2 years ago, he said, "What's the difference between the NAACP and the KKK? Wait for it, ... One has a sense of shame to cover their racist blank faces." He put that out 2 years ago in a tweet. And they addressed that Monday night on Men Tell All. And there's, I think, 6 or 7 African-American men on the season, and so they were all in this room, right?
And Rachel's the first African-American bachelor
Correct.
in Bachelor history.
Yes. And Lee Garrett is from Nashville, and he would not say until the very end, when he was basically coerced by these guys to say, okay, he wouldn't say that it was racist. Because what he kept saying is, I needed to be taught. I didn't have the education. Thank you guys for being willing to teach me how this isn't okay. But he wouldn't say that it was racist. Right. And then finally at the end he did. And all of the men stood up, gave him hugs, shook his hand and said, we're willing to teach you. We're willing to give you the information you need. But again, that wasn't given to him at a certain point in his life in the community he grew up in. So there are still tensions between races in a lot of these communities in America because things simply aren't taught. People are not given the information.
And it's just general facts too. So with that, to say something like that pretty much says you lack elementary education.
And that is another...
Like certain things...
Or the ability to research before you put something out that racially controversial.
Correct.
You know, whether
it's just factually not true.
Yeah. You're an adult, so whose responsibility at that point is it to educate? Is it the people who have been oppressed all of these years? Is it their responsibility to have to tell, retell, and retell their story and bang it over your head before you understand it? Or is it our responsibility as a country to know not Black history, to know American history?
Yes.
And I think that is so much, and I'm learning now as an adult and in this sort of position where I am challenged to speak on things that aren't in my normal everyday research or vocabulary. So it requires me to do research, but how about those who aren't put in a position like mine where they're having to research things every day because every word that comes out of our mouths, it is being watched and listened to. So I would like to know from your perspective, Cornelia, because I know you've talked about this before, whose responsibility is it, and what does it feel like to be asked over and over and over again? What is your perspective?
Well,
like I'm doing right now.
Well, it's annoying. I mean, it's annoying. Well, because I'm a believer of we have access to the same information,
right?
Especially now. Back in the day, before the internet and before we had this influx of books and this movement to readdress history and readdress things that happened in the past, I could see where you could fall into the grain of just simply not knowing.
If I'm not taught,
but
it's
however,
not my responsibility.
It's our personal responsibilities to not remain ignorant. Especially what I'm finding is sometimes it's not even the fact that people don't know or that they, just didn't have access to information. Sometimes they're not open to hearing it because it makes them uncomfortable. Getting past the comfort level of having to learn this, because if I tell you, hey, this is, from my perspective, this is what it is and this is what it feels like, to some it's like, well, they take it personal. It's like, well, I don't do that, or that's not me. And then that blocks you from actually doing the research and learning. So again, I feel like it isn't my responsibility. But whenever people ask me, if you ask me a question, I'll tell you. And I don't know everything. I'm just speaking on my perspective and the things that I've seen. But it's in regards to Lee situations like that and that tweet. That's just stupid.
Yeah, it's just ignorance.
Like that's just basically
wrong.
You either did not pay attention in school at all. Your school didn't teach you this at all, but basic knowledge tells you what the NAACP is.
Right, and then the argument from the men was, why would you come on a show when the African-American female was the person at the end of this? Like if you felt that way,
right.
you have a responsibility to know these things by this point in our lives.
Because when you have children with the said person that you were potentially going to fall in love with, half of your child is going to be of this culture and community.
Well, that's a whole nother
but I honestly, I was impressed. I was actually a little bit like taken aback by how welcoming these men were to opening up to the idea of helping him, quote unquote, figure things out. I mean, they easily could have turned this around, but I think in that moment, I think he taught them a little bit that some of these people who you can literally be in the same grouping of men with on this show are still at that level, or were just there less than 2 years ago, or they had no understanding of another race and felt like they could make comments that were that asinine. And so now to see that they're being so open to saying, hey, we want to welcome you into our tribe here and we're going to teach you. I was like, whoa, that was big. They went above.
They were nice because I have a zero tolerance.
Yeah.
I'm like, nah, I'm done with you.
They took the high road.
Well, the fact that, what do we have to say about the network for ABC to allow that conversation to happen? Because while this is reality television, we know this is scripted television, scripted reality. So to me, it goes, okay, ABC, stepping it up in terms of boldness to have that conversation that needed to be had, especially because this is a season where you have the first African-American female or African-American person to be the lead on this show. So I didn't watch that episode.
Yeah, it was on Monday. It was good.
Monday.
We do have some comments from you guys, though. Janet Piper says, I'm always interested in learning about our history and how far we have come since the dark times. I'm looking forward to seeing the movie.
Okay.
And then also we see Lisa, who says you can research everything. However, that still won't allow you to ultimately know what effects it actually has in someone's personality to their core. So she's saying, yeah, you can learn all the things you want, you can read all the things you want, but how are you really going to take that? What is that going to mean for how you move forward with that information?
I think it's important to have conversations, you know, to not only learn something, but in the way they do book clubs, right? You read a chapter or 10, and then you get around and powwow, because there are things that you're going to completely miss in a lesson that is being taught. I know right now Game of Thrones, a hot episode of Game of Thrones just went down on Sunday. I watched it through, my eyes. When you start reading the chats online, the people who are really invested in the seasons and every line that comes out of these people's mouths, you start to learn, wow, there was a whole scene about the way in which men are portrayed as higher beings in film and in television over women. And that completely went over my head until I look at it and go, wow, these things are seeping into our brains from the day we start watching television and film that we don't even know about. So these conversations after you do the learning need to be had so you can understand from different perspectives, from different people who are part of different movements and different groups. It's okay to not understand initially, but as long as you keep your mind open and then go, okay, and be willing to say, wow, am I a racist? Because go ahead and speak on that.
And I want to speak to, real quick, because we got to move on, to the topic of being called racist or something that you say is racist. There's this stigma with the word racist where people automatically think slavery, the N-word, and not knowing any black people. That is 2017. That is no longer the case. Saying certain things to people like, oh, when I look at you, I don't notice that you're black. That can be considered racist. Where coming from someone saying it, they're just trying to be nice. Like, I don't see color, especially when I see you're good.
Equals.
Or some people saying, oh, but you're one of the good black people. I've heard that. So in 2017, the idea or saying that to someone doesn't necessarily mean exactly what it meant back in the day. So I think that's why people kind of get this reaction to where they're like, I'm not racist. My family had nothing to do with slavery and I don't say the N-word and I know black people. It's that original stigma with it, instead of thinking at racism as an act of oppression. If you say something oppressive or something that can be deemed oppressive, then that can be
by that group of people. Because even if you don't think that that's not what you meant by it, you got to change the way in which those words come out of your mouth, because the people who have been oppressed all of these years, and I'm not just talking about black culture, I'm talking about all different cultures, if they don't like it, then why are you still doing it?
Right.
Just because it doesn't
because you feel like it shouldn't mean anything doesn't mean that it doesn't.
Doesn't mean it doesn't.
So we'll end it on that note. Again, be open-minded, learn with us. We are all in this conversation together. Thank you for the positive vibes that you were sending and on Facebook. And the movie, by the way, producer Billy just reminded me, the movie Detroit, which we just spent some time talking about, opens this Friday. I will go and see it because I need to know the story, but also remain open-minded and look online and educate myself and have these conversations about what we learned and what more we can learn about not just this incident in Detroit in 1967 on one summer night, but the thousands of untold stories.
Yeah.
So let's move on now.
Okay.